Imagine a family going for a short vacation at their weekend house, only to never be heard from again. When finally discovered after over a month, the only thing found was their decomposed bodies, rotting away and filled with maggots, implying they had been dead almost since the day they arrived. Such was the fate of the young Perry family. On November 5th, 1993, Michael Rubenstein, a man from Louisiana, dropped off his stepson Daryl Perry and his wife Evelyn aka Annie, along with their 4-year-old daughter Crystal, at his vacation cabin in Summit, Mississippi, for a short getaway from the city. The family was supposed to be back soon, with those back home having begun to worry as nobody had heard from the Perrys for over a month. Rubenstein feared a mishap visited the cabin on December 16, 1993, only to be met with the horrifying sight of 3 rotting corpses crawling with maggots. What could have happened in the cabin that led to this chilling discovery? Did the victims fall prey to a lethal break-in, or was there an even deeper mystery behind the deaths? Let's find out what had brought the Perry family to meet such a grim fate. In New Orleans, Louisiana, lived the Perrys. Doris Perry, the single mother, became Doris Rubenstein after her second marriage with Alan Michael Rubenstein, a cab driver from Louisiana. Rubenstein was a father to his daughter Tanya, while Doris had 2 young boys, Terrell and David, from her previous marriage. 24-year-old Daryl was married to Evelyn, also known as Annie, and together had a 4-year-old girl, Crystal. Daryl was doing time in prison during the early 90s when Annie had an affair. Meanwhile, Crystal was being taken care of by Doris and Rubenstein at this time, who did not like Annie's extramarital relationship. When Daryl got out of prison in the fall of '93, Rubenstein suggested the couple work on their marriage, and that spending some time alone together would do them good. For that, he offered them his cabin in Summit, a sparsely populated town in Pike County, Mississippi. On the morning of November 5th, 1993, before leaving for the cabin, Annie met her close friend Sue Bello, who wanted Annie to stay back because her birthday was coming up. Promising Sue of returning back before November 16th, Annie left, and Rubenstein drove the family to the cabin, a 130-mile drive from New Orleans. He had dropped them off at the cabin and returned back to Louisiana, taking his car with him. Daryl and Annie did not have a phone in the cabin, so they had to use Crescens, who was their neighbor at the cabin site. On November 11th, 1993, Annie had called her friend Sue, and they both discussed how they would celebrate Sue's birthday. Annie told her she was bored in the cabin and would be back home before November 16th. However, November 16th had passed, and Perry's had still not arrived home. Annie's mother, Zula Loke, had grown concerned when she didn't hear from her daughter for several weeks. She had spoken to her daughter's mother-in-law, Doris, and asked Rubenstein for directions to the cabin. Rubenstein told Zula that she would not be able to find the cabin by herself, stating that he would do it and check on the Perrys on her behalf. Rubenstein had to cancel the trip a few times before he finally went to the cabin on December 16, 1993, to check on them. As he opened the door, he was greeted with nothing short of a nightmare, with the rotting bodies of Darren and Annie in the living room. The TV was on, and as he passed the bodies to reach the adjoining bedroom, he saw little Crystal dead on the bed. Maggots were feeding on all the bodies. Darren's eyes had been eaten through, and Annie had a hole the size of a fist in her stomach. Panicked, Ruben told about the deadly sight to his neighbor, Gail Watson, and called Pike County Sheriff's Department immediately. Sheriff C.V. Glynis and investigator Donald Lindley arrived at the scene and witnessed the severely decomposed bodies of the family. The cabin, however, was neat and undisturbed, showing no signs of a struggle. Later, Rubenstein was called to the Summit Police Department, and his statement was taken by the sheriff himself. As per the notes, Rubenstein had disclosed the 1.5-month timeline, testifying that he had dropped Daryl, Annie, and Crystal at the cabin from New Orleans on November 5, 1993, after which he returned home on November 16th. Rubenstein stated that Daryl had made a call back home and spoke to Doris and Rubenstein on November 11th about scheduling a return. However, Rubenstein claimed that he would only be able to pick them up on November 26th. When he went and knocked at the cabin on the agreed date, nobody had answered. He usually had a key to the cabin, but on that day, he had forgotten to bring it along with him. Rubenstein added that he had asked the neighbors about the cabin, Sean and Daryl and Annie, who said they had not heard from them and had assumed that the family had returned to New Orleans. Rubenstein then continued to state that he had returned to Louisiana after not getting any response and had gone back to the cabin on December 16th this time with the key, discovering his family dead inside the cabin at this time. Dr. Emily Ward, who conducted an autopsy on the bodies, had confirmed that Annie died due to multiple stab wounds. No defensive wounds were found on her body, and she had been stabbed 8 times to the chest area, in which 2 lethal stabs were made to the left lung. Daryl's body, on the other hand, was highly decomposed. His autopsy report stated that he had also died due to lethal stabs around his chest, lungs, and heart. Some slash wounds that were found on his arms indicated a defensive struggle during the attack. One slash wound on Daryl's neck measured about 7 inches, cutting into him ear to ear. Due to the heavily decomposed state of their bodies, no blood samples were able to be recovered from any of the bodies. However, urine samples that were taken had indicated nicotine, caffeine, and acetaminophen in their system. Crystal's autopsy stated that she had suffered hemorrhaging to the neck. With that, the cause of death for Crystal was determined to be strangulation. Dr. Stephen Hain, a forensic pathologist on the case, claimed that the homicides had occurred almost a month before the bodies were discovered. When detectives interrogated Gail Jackson, the neighbor at the cabin, she said she knew the Perrys as they had gone over to use the phone at her place and always crossed by her yard to go to the grocery store. However, she had not seen them for almost 4 or 5 weeks prior to the grim discovery of the corpses. Another thing Gail claimed to have found unusual was that the same lights had stayed on in the cabin for almost 4.5 weeks, without ever being turned off. She had sent her son Crescent to check on the Perrys 1.5 weeks ago, but nobody had answered when he knocked on the door. On January 5th, 1994, Officer Glenn Applewhite, a criminal investigator for Mississippi State Patrol, went to the Rubensteins' home in Louisiana to speak with the family members. He wasn't able to get any information from Doris, as she appeared to be highly medicated or intoxicated. With no new information, he had to return back empty-handed. Up until now, police had been collecting pieces of information without any serious suspect. However, things began to change when on January 12th, Daryl's brother David was tracked down and called in for an interview. David unexpectedly proved to be a major witness in the riddle when he shed a light on some of the family's deeper secrets. He exclusively told the officers that if they dug deeper, they would find an insurance policy somewhere in the roots of these killings, connecting them to none other than Rubenstein. This was a serious accusation, and when detectives looked into it, they did find out that around 2 years ago in 1991, Rubenstein had taken out a $250,000 insurance policy in the name of his step-granddaughter Crystal. The amount indeed was ample motive for anyone to commit such a crime. With growing suspicion, Rubenstein at this point had become the main suspect. To know more about the policy, George Henney, an insurance agent for New York Life in Louisiana, was called into the investigation, who confirmed the policy to be legitimate. The application date of the policy was September 13, 1991, and the policy was due in 1993, a few months before the killings. According to the policy, Doris, being the blood relative of Crystal, was the owner and first beneficiary. Rubenstein was the second, and Crystal's parents were the third beneficiaries. Adding more to the already piling suspicions, David had provided the detectives with one more crucial piece of information. He had revealed that Rubenstein was lying to detectives about his visit to the cabin on November 26th. Instead, he had gone to the cabin on November 16th, as Daryl had told him about the visit the next day. This resulted in Rubenstein being under even more suspicion because if this information was correct, it would directly link Rubenstein with the killings, as autopsy reports estimated the death of the family almost a month ago, from December 16, 1993. Rubenstein was yet again called for a talk, and when asked about his whereabouts on November 16th and 17th, Rubenstein had immediately asked his right to an attorney. The fingerprints, DNAs, and blood samples taken from the crime scene by Officer Applewhite didn't match with Rubenstein, and he wasn't able to prove Rubenstein's visit to the cabin on November 16th. The case against Rubenstein was not strong enough to take to the court due to a lack of evidence, and hence officials decided to keep looking. With no evidence and Rubenstein lawyering up, the detectives had decided to look into another suspect, Sidney Pagg. He was an African American with whom Annie was having an affair. While Daryl had been in prison during the 90s, Annie was living with Sidney. Doris and Rubenstein had taken care of Crystal as they didn't want her to be near Sidney, whom she had started to call her stepdaddy. Rubenstein also had affirmed that Sidney had every reason to commit such a crime as he was a big drug addict and wanted Annie at all cost. Sheriff Glynis unofficially stated that after the interview, Rubenstein slammed his fist on the roof of his car and made racist remarks toward Sidney, saying he was afraid Sidney would have Crystal. When interrogating Sidney, he told the officers that he had met Annie sometime during 1989 and they were just good friends. He used to sell drugs back then and did time in prison from January 1990 to February of 1991 due to that. When he had gotten out, he again met Annie at a mutual party, and that was when they got involved in a serious relationship. At the time, Daryl was always in and out of prison and did not have a stable life. Sidney testified that after a few months of relationship with Annie, they had their own apartment and stayed together for almost 8 months. During that time, Crystal stayed with Doris and Rubenstein. Sidney stated very clearly that Rubenstein was a very racist man and harbored deep hatred for all African Americans. Sidney stated that Rubenstein never let him meet Crystal and had revealed a much darker truth regarding Rubenstein. Sidney testified that Rubenstein took physical advantage of Annie multiple times as Daryl and Annie were dependent on him for food and money. Annie's friend Sue Bello told detectives about a time when Annie needed $30 to buy a present for Crystal's birthday, and she asked Rubenstein for the favor. She had overheard him agreeing to help her out if she paid back by sleeping with him. Kay Kelly, another close friend of Annie, also revealed a time when Crystal got chickenpox and Annie had requested for some medication and some money from Rubenstein, where he again made Annie sleep with him first. Kelly also exposed Rubenstein's efforts to convince Annie to sign some sort of document. Although all this information was crucial to the case, it still didn't prove if Rubenstein had visited the cabin on November 16th or that he was involved in the untimely death of the family. Doris and Rubenstein had claimed the check of $250,000 on the insurance policy on January 26, 1994, and with no other leads to follow, the case had gone cold. Nearly 5 years later, in 1998, Officer Applewhite came across Bill Goodwin, the deputy DA of Pike County who was working on a similar case, where a father killed his child for insurance money. When Applewhite got to know that he had convicted the killer in that case, he handed over the file of 1993 Perry murders to Goodwin. After reading into the case, Goodwin knew who they needed to approach. They met with Dr. William Bass, an expert studying the interaction of dead bodies under different environmental conditions, insects, and other organisms for 40 years. Observing decay and decomposition patterns in dead bodies for a long time, Dr. Bass had an expertise in telling how long a body has been dead. Seeing the pictures of the autopsy and crime scene, he immediately confirmed that the Perry family had been dead for over a month. The foundation behind the statement was the metamorphic life cycle of a fly. Dr. Bass explained that first critters to approach a dead body are blowflies. When they feed over the corpse for several days, they give hundreds of eggs that hatch and turn into little maggots. Maggots feed on the body and mature for more than 2 weeks. After that, maggots undergo metamorphosis and are wrapped in a black coating called pupa cases. 5 to 6 days later, the pupa case cracks and a fly is born. This whole process takes at least a month. Although Dr. Bass was sure about the timing of death, he did not find pupa cases in any picture to prove that the whole cycle of blowfly's birth had taken place. The case was still weak, but the testimony based on fly larvae, confirmed by an expert like Dr. Bass, was enough to make an arrest. In September 1998, Rubenstein was arrested by Pike County Sheriff's Department on charges of murdering Darrell Perry, Evelyn Annie Loke, and Crystal Perry, and was imprisoned in Pike County Jail. While he was an inmate there, Rubenstein became friends with James Stevens, another inmate in the jail. Here, Rubenstein opened up with Stevens and made the case easier himself. Stevens testified later that Rubenstein told him that he killed his stepson, stepson's wife, and their little daughter for cashing out on an insurance policy. Also talking about how he killed the family, Rubenstein told Stevens that he went to the cabin and stabbed Darrell and Annie until being sure of their death. With Crystal, he did not specify how she was killed, but it was assumed to either be strangulation or choking. With Stevens' statement, Rubenstein was indicted for capital murder of Crystal and murders of Darrell and Annie. Rubenstein's first trial took place in 1999 for 12 days, but it went to mistrial as the jury failed to reach a verdict. The case was retried in the year 2000, and this time in the trial, Dr. William Bass was also present. He sat at the back and watched as the state medical examiner gave his testimony. The imagery from the autopsy was being flashed in the courtroom when Bass saw a close-up picture of Crystal, which he had not seen before. Dr. Bass rose up from his chair and requested the judge if he could examine the images once again. Permitted to do so, he found pupa cases present on the head of Crystal in this new image. With this, any doubt about the time of the murders and Rubenstein's fate had been put to rest. As the trial ended, the jury convicted Rubenstein on all 3 murder charges. On February 5, 2000, Alan Michael Rubenstein was given death row on the charges of a capital murder of Crystal. Along with that, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life imprisonment charges for the murders of Darrell and Annie. 9 years later, in 2009, while Rubenstein was still on Pike County death row, a new sentence was handed over. The Mississippi Supreme Court overturned Rubenstein's death penalty, stating that the judge from the original trial failed to instruct the jury about all the sentencing options available. Rubenstein is still in jail today, serving 2 life imprisonment sentences and 1 life sentence without the possibility of parole. Annie, Darrell, and Crystal Perry now rest in peace, laying side by side at West Lawn Memorial Park and Mausoleum in Louisiana. Another inmate friend of Michael Rubenstein, Earl Bollinger, told the investigators about Rubenstein admitting to him to having killed his first wife, his other daughter, and her boyfriend due to separate reasons. Although Rubenstein never pled guilty in court about the Perrys' murders, what do you think about this confession of Rubenstein? Do you think a man like Rubenstein could also have committed other homicides in the past? Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you like this video, then make sure to like, share, and subscribe.